I have two different texts this morning to read to you. I'm going to go ahead and read them at the beginning. One comes out of the first book of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 12. And the other one comes out of the first book of the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 35. And you may wonder when I read these two stories how they are interlinked, because they probably won't seem like something that is fitting together with each other. But hopefully, if I do my job properly this morning, it'll all come together by the end. So the first one, again, is out of Matthew chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 46 through 50. And Jesus is speaking here. Now, this may seem like just a simple set of verses. It may not seem like something very significant. But Jesus is saying something very significant in this passage. And it says, "While he was yet speaking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, seeking to speak to him." So we've got Mary and his brothers, and they're out there wanting to see Jesus. So Jesus is well, if you read the rest of the first part of the chapter, he's been out teaching, he's been doing all sorts of different things, and he's got this multitude that he's speaking with, and his mom shows up and wants to see him. And one said to him, "Behold, your mother and your brothers stand outside, seeking to speak to you." But he answered him who spoke to him, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" And then he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, "Behold, my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother." Now we're going to, as I said, go to the first book of the Bible in Genesis chapter 35. And we're going to just read a small little portion of a story of the birth of one of Jacob and Rachel's sons. And this story, of course, has to do with why I entitled this sermon A New Name. And it has to do with one of Jacob's sons receiving a new name. And we see this happening a lot in the Bible. Now, there was a little bit of friction going on back then. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the story. But to give a little bit of background, there was, Jacob, he wanted to marry Rachel. He was tricked into marrying Leah first, so he ends up getting these two sisters as wives. They're kind of in competition with each other. Rachel is barren for a while, and then she finally gets pregnant with Joseph, and now she's going to have this other child. But something's going to happen to her as she's giving in birth. But I want you to focus on the aspect of this story of how this child's name is changed. Because whenever a name is changed in the Bible, there is something significant, that there's a meaning behind it. We have Abram, and God changed his name to Abraham. And we have Sarai, and her name was changed to Sarah. Jacob himself, the Lord gave a new name. He called him Israel. And then, of course, you go into the New Testament, and we even see, it doesn't really describe as to why, but we see Saul, and his name also known as Paul. So there's a lot of significance to these name changes, and it usually means something. So again, from chapter 35, I'm going to read verses 16 through 20. And it says, "They traveled from Bethel, and there was still some distance to come to Ephrath, and Rachel travailed." So in other words, she went into labor. She was in hard labor. And while she was in hard labor, the midwife said to her, "Don't be afraid, for now you will have another son." And as her soul was departing, for she died, she named him Benoni. Now, if you look at the translation for the name Benoni, it means son of my sorrow or son of my trouble. But his father named him Benjamin. And if we look at the translation for that name, it means son of my right hand. Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, also called Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar on her grave, and the same is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. You know, when I was a little boy, my grandma, I remember this. I don't know, I wasn't too much older than probably Josiah, but I actually remember this, so I was excited to see these papers later. I remember being at my grandmother's house in Maryland, and she pulled out these old papers from the 1800s, and they were all written in German. And she had no idea what they said. She wanted to be able to find someone. And she'd had them for a very long time, probably her whole life. They'd been passed on to her. And she knew they had something to do with our family history. and she really wanted to get them translated because she wanted to know what they said. But she never found anyone during her life that could translate them. And so after she passed away, I ended up with the papers, and I ended up finding somebody not too long after I got them that actually knew someone who spoke German, and they said, well, we'd be happy to get them translated for you. So we made copies of them and sent them to this woman, and so I'm expecting this great big, family secret of, how we got here, and something big or something from the 1800s that we should be proud of. And so the guy comes back, and he almost didn't want to tell me what the papers were translated and what they said. And so I said, no, just tell me what it is. And he said, it turns out one of your ancestors divorced his wife and left his kids in Germany, and these were court papers, and he ran away from them to get here to America. So your family came here because he was running away from his responsibility and his wife and his children. And so I was kind of glad that Grandma never got those translated. She never found that out because she thought it was something we would end up being proud about. But I was also kind of glad because she had already struggled enough with her identity and her family's legacy. And I tell you that story. I could tell you more stories. And most of the time in conversation, I don't like to tell these stories because then people would start looking at me and say, hey, you're the one related to these people. And I wonder if, this is some kind of something that's been passed on. But I remember my grandmother telling me a story of something that she was ashamed of that she knew of. Now, she remembers this man. He had gotten out of prison, but it was her grandfather. And she was telling me that, this is our family legacy. She said her grandfather, he was German. Of course, we all know that. They came from Germany. And I don't know if this is the same one or if this is a different one. I really don't know the history. But I just know that she said that when the First World War took place, that of course Germany was our enemies. And so they were still loyal to Germany. And he didn't want his children fighting, even though they were living over here in I think Baltimore, Maryland. They didn't want their sons fighting against the homeland. So he ordered his sons not to join the military and go into this war. But one of his sons did anyways. And so when this happened, he was very, very upset. And he wrote this son off, pretty much said, you're no longer a son of mine. You're never allowed to come back into this house. And he told his wife, if he ever comes back into this house, I do not want you to allow him in. Now, he was at work one day, and the son came home from war. And of course, the mother allowed him to come in, and she was making him lunch. And of course, it just so happened that the dad came home from work early, and he saw his son sitting there at the table and his wife feeding him, and he didn't say a word. He just went upstairs, and the mom said, maybe you better leave. And so her son leaves, and she turned around and started doing the dishes. And the man came home, and he shot his wife in the back while she was doing the dishes and killed her. And so this was a lot of legacy here that is nothing really to be proud of. And to make matters worse for Grandma, she was an orphan at the age of 4. So first her father died of skin cancer. And she had good parents when they were alive, but again, she was a little child. Her father died of skin cancer. I'm told, back in the 30s, they didn't really know what to do with it as much. And he had to even wear something around his face because it was eating his face away. And then about a year later, I'm told by one of my uncles that her mother had an aneurysm and passed away. And so her older brothers, because she had older brothers, tried to watch her and take care of her until some neighbors complained that these boys were in this house with this little girl. And so she was taken away from them. And she was put into an orphanage away from all of her family. And I tell you this because all of these things deeply affected my grandmother's life and her decisions and her emotions and who she was for the remainder of her life. She had an orphaned mentality. Her family had left her a devastating legacy. And she was literally a daughter of sorrow, as that name was given to Benjamin Ben-Oni. Someone that had no one to care for her, who had to fend for herself in all things. And that stigma followed her until one cold day in December 2004, when she decided that she had had enough of this cruel legacy of this world, and she took her own life. So you see, she had inherited a spiritual legacy of Rachel, who in turn had inherited the spiritual legacy from Adam and Eve, if we really want to trace it all the way back. Now, Rachel was a bitter woman. The Bible, now we look back on her as, this person in the Bible that we can go back and look at all these great people that we want to learn about and maybe learn from, and Rachel is one of those names that we would pull out of the hat there. But the Bible itself doesn't really paint a very flattering picture of this matriarch. Now, granted, she was beautiful in appearance. The Bible does say that. And she certainly was, as I mentioned earlier, the woman that Jacob truly wanted as his wife. She was the one that he was smitten with. But of course, her father deceived Jacob into marrying Leah, her sister, first. And because of this rivalry, because he eventually gets both women as a wife, but because of this rivalry that her father created between the two girls, they were in competition with one another for their husband. And part of this competition was to bear Jacob children, because they thought, if I can bear him the most children that he'll be proud of, he will love me. That was what each of them were thinking. But Rachel had trouble conceiving, the Bible tells us, and she was angry about it. In fact, she was angry with Jacob about it. At one point in the Bible, she says, "Give me children or I will die." In other words, she's mad at him, blaming him for not having children, and he gets mad right back at her. But this competition with her sister caused her to give her handmaid to her husband so that he could get her handmaid pregnant, and then Rachel could claim the child as her own. Now, of course, Leah, in turn, does the same thing. But I want you to think about this. Talk about selfish sibling rivalries that drag others into the mess that we've created. Here they are, dragging other women, and how selfish that is. You're going to bear this child for 9 months, but it's going to be mine. And when Jacob finally leaves his father-in-law's household, because they've been living there for a very long time, the Bible tells us that Rachel even steals her own father's idols. And then she lies to everyone about it, including her father when he catches up with them. She sits down on top of the idols and says she's on her period and she can't stand up because she's trying to hide them. So we're not talking about the most righteous of women here in the first place, and we need to understand that. So when Rachel finally does conceive, at first, as I said, she bears Joseph. But after this, she gets pregnant one more time, which is where we're at in the story here. But during her labor, when it's obvious that she is not going to make it, in one last defiant breath of selfishness, thinking only of herself, she names the boy Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow, or son of my trouble. Now think about what that mother was passing down to her son with her very last breath, the legacy that she was leaving him. Now, yes, he was physically becoming an orphan by her death, but she was also trying to make him a spiritual orphan by allowing him to inherit her guilt. She was placing all the bitterness that she had felt in her life right square on the shoulders of this newborn baby boy who was just taking his first breath, had not done anything in this world, and who was innocent of all of her problems, and she was putting it right on him. That was his inheritance from his mother. She was making sure that he would go to his grave being reminded of her pain every time someone just spoke his very name. And there was only one person that could do anything about it. And the Bible tells us that he did. Jacob did not want his son to be a spiritual orphan. He didn't want him to inherit this legacy of pain and defeat from his mother. He wanted his son's legacy to be one of victory. So the Bible tells us that he rejects his wife's last act of bitterness and selfishness, and he renames his son Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. You see, Jacob took that shame and the reproach away from his son's shoulders, and he gave the boy something better. He gave him hope. Benjamin transitioned from being the cause of his dead mother's pain, that being his sole existence, to becoming the right hand of strength of the father of the tribes of Israel. A man with a proud legacy. And these were two completely different legacies indeed that he could have chosen that he could have had for his life. But you see, I tell you this story because the Bible is not some book of 1,000 random disconnected stories of the ancient world that have no relevance in our lives today, or that we should just get bored reading, because there is actually a very real spiritual significance in this story for each and every one of us. There's a real significance for you in this story. And that is why God put it there in the first place. Even some of the stories we don't understand, there's a reason why they're there. Sometimes we just have to look for it, and God wants us to do that. He says, seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. So this story means something. Now, spiritually speaking, we've all inherited that bitterness of Rachel. We come from a long line of orphans. Now, Adam was orphaned when he was separated from God, when he first transgressed and committed sin. And we are orphaned from our father Adam through death, and from our physical fathers here on earth through death. And orphans don't always make the best of decisions. They don't. Now, why is that? In fact, when I worked in the juvenile detention centers, a lot of them, they either had one or two absent parents in their houses. Orphans don't make the best decisions. Why? Well, for one, their lives are guided by their own pain, and when we're guided by pain, it's like a wounded animal. We just want to attack. We want to, anybody that's trying to help us, we want to come against them. And two, because most of the time, they've had no real instruction in their lives from an adult that took some type of interest in them. So no one to guide them down the right path, or to tell them, hey, you probably shouldn't do that. You should probably go this way, or at least just give them some sort of instruction. So they have to try to figure this thing called life out on their own. And this is why I gave you the example of my grandmother. Her parents were successful when they were alive. He was actually a business owner in Baltimore, very successful, had a couple of businesses, I believe she actually told me. And things were very good for them. Her mother was very good. She took care of the children. But tragedy struck, and they both died when Grandma was only, I think she was 3 when he died. She was 4 when she died, so they didn't really have very much time in order to put anything into her life. And then in turn, she went to go live in an orphanage. She didn't even have a foster family that was taking care of her. She's just living with a group of children with not very much instruction. She was very bitter about the fact that she had been taken away from her brothers, the only people that she actually knew that loved her and cared for her, and placed with all of these strangers. And so no one taught her about life. So when she got older and had to make the big decisions in life, she made wrong decisions. She married an alcoholic. She made a string of bad decisions, things that still affect the family even to this day, and she's been gone since 2004. Now, I don't personally blame her for a lot of what she did, because she just didn't know any better. She didn't have any instruction in her life. No one took interest in this little girl. No one fathered or mothered her. And the same is true for us. We've inherited from Adam and Eve the spiritual name Benoni. And we are sons of sorrow, daughters of sorrow, inheriting this world. And just look around at this world. It's always in turmoil. It's always in trouble. That's our inheritance. That's our legacy, because that's what we do outside of our lives in this world. But my friends, we don't have to walk out of here with our heads hung low like we're completely defeated in this either, because even though that's what the world tells us we should be doing, and it actually does, and it does tell us that we should accept our name of Benoni, sons of sorrow. It tells us that we have nothing to be proud of, and that we need to recognize it. I remember actually one of those juvenile detention centers that I worked at out in New Mexico. There was a lieutenant there, and she made us watch this video in training, and one of the video was called Blue Eyes. And the whole premise of the video was that white people are born inherently racist, and that they're the only race that is born inherently racist, and that we have to get over this inherent racism inside of us. And I remember at the end of the video, she asked us how we felt about it, and I sometimes have a big mouth, and I open my mouth when I probably shouldn't, and it gets me in trouble. And I raised my hand, and I said, well, wait a minute. I said, I'm not racist. I said, I'm not inherently racist against black people or natives or anything like that. I said, I don't feel that way, and I wasn't raised that way. And she just came at me and told me all about how our history is one of slavery, of enslaving other people and doing all of these different things to people, and it's inherent inside of us, but these other races don't have that. And I remember thinking to myself, there's something wrong with what you're saying here. But this was the type of person she was. In fact, she would tell us in some of these training classes, about some of the different things that had happened at the jail. In fact, I think there was a couple of officers that had done something illegal in there. And then she would say, now this is our history. We need to embrace this as our history and recognize that we're wrong in this and everything. But this is what the world tries to tell us. It tries to tell us that we just need to embrace this. This is who we are, that we're wrong. It's inherent inside of us. But this is the spirit of Rachel. It's the feelings of guilt. And it needs to be firmly rejected by us. Because thousands of years ago, King David wrote in Psalms 27 verse 10, "For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me up." And Jesus Christ said in John chapter 14, "I will not leave you orphans." You see, we have someone who wants to take an active role in our lives. And Paul said in Romans chapter 8 verse 15, "For you didn't receive the spirit of bondage again." And when he says again, it means we've already accepted it once by being born into this world. He's talking about our new birth, being born again. He says, "For you didn't receive a spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." You see, when Adam and Eve and all of our other ancestors passed down to us the legacy of the name Ben-Oni, which means sons of sorrow, God sent His Son to this orphanage that we call planet Earth. And Jesus said, "Your Father has chosen a new name for you, my friends." You don't have to be a son of sorrow anymore. You don't have to be a daughter of sorrow anymore, because the Father has named you Benjamin. And with that name comes a family heritage of victory. And with that name comes the Holy Spirit of your Father, who rescues you from the orphanage and will guide you into making the right decisions here in this life. Those old things are wiped away. You don't have to cling on to them like your legacy anymore, because your new legacy is in my Father. You're not an orphan anymore. You're not alone anymore. You're not a jerk or an alcoholic or a failure, or you name it anymore. Your bitterness, your bad attitude, your mistakes, your old habits, every last one of your flaws that has made you feel lesser than others, or that has put your foot in your mouth or gotten you in trouble, Christ has taken that legacy on for you, and He put it to death on the cross. Now you might ask, but why do I still feel like an orphan? Why do I still feel alone? Now it's been said, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. But you know what? That's not true at all. That's not biblical. And that's why I started the sermon with the text from the book of Matthew. Because you see, you can choose your family. In fact, you have to choose your family. You have to make a choice. And you can choose your name. Jesus said in that text, "Who is my mother?" He said, "Who are my brothers?" And then He stretched out His hands toward His disciples, people that were not blood related to Him. And He said, "Look, here's my family." And then He said, "Whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he or she is my brother and sister and mother." Or in other words, they have become part of the family of God. They've taken on this new name, this new legacy. You see, God has given us a new name. He has given us the spirit of adoption that Paul spoke about. But we can keep our old legacy and our old name and our old lifestyles and the lifestyles of this world if we really want to, because that's what love really is. It's a choice. We got to make a choice whether or not we want those lifestyles or whether or not we want to be part of the family of God, because it's never going to be forced upon us. And God has chosen to love you. And He wants you in turn to choose to give up those things to love Him. That's what a true relationship is all about. That's why it says, draw close to Him, and He will draw close to you. I gave this analogy last week in Sunday school. We've had these other kids, and because of that, it's kind of taken some time away from my kids. And it was a couple of Sundays ago, Josiah had been acting up, and I didn't know why, and I was just getting frustrated. And we were doing a youth group downstairs, and I was trying to get all the kids to sit down so that I could pray and so that we could get started. And Josiah was just clinging onto my leg, and he was not listening, and I just got so angry at him and yelled at him and forced him to go over to his chair. But then when I looked at his face fall, I realized there was more than just him not wanting to listen. Something was going on. So I took him outside, And I had a little talk with him, and I said, what's wrong, Josiah? And he clinged on to me, and he said, I just want my daddy. And that's what we have to do. We have to say, I just want my daddy. And guess what? I spent time with him. He sought me out. I recognized him as my son. And I came to him and I gave him what he needed. And that's what God is asking from us. So my friends, as I've illustrated today through the real life example of an orphan who lived and died in her inherited legacy of defeat of the lifestyles of this world, trust me when I tell you that there is a better way. Now Benjamin could have grown up and decided that he preferred the legacy of his mother over the legacy of his father. He could have done that. But why would he want to leave the victory behind and carry on that burden of bitterness for the rest of his life? And the question that we all need to ask ourselves this morning is, why would we choose to live in that bitterness also? Is sin that pleasurable for us that we don't care that our lives are torn apart? That we'd rather live as Ben-Oni than as Benjamin? You see, we are not orphans this morning, or we don't have to be orphans this morning. Those of us who have come to Christ, we have to reject that name of Ben-Oni. We have to reject that legacy of Adam, that legacy of Rachel. And we need to accept the adoption of the Lord, and we need to accept our new name. And that name is a name of victory. So let's reject that legacy of Rachel and go running into the open arms of our Father instead, because He is waiting